So one of the most common questions that I've been getting lately is what is the best sight for insert weapon here? Well, I'm here to answer that question for you, and I want to start off by saying that it is 100% personal preference, but there are some differences between the sights that I think are important to take into consideration when picking what is the right sight for you. Now, I'm going to give you a general rule of thumb is I find it is best to find one sight that works for you and use that with every gun where it is applicable. Obviously, if a weapon doesn't have that sight, then you might want to go with the next closest thing. And there are some weapons that have unique variants of sights, and I want to go over the reasons why you might use some sights. There's also some other things I don't know if they are bugs or intended, but I did want to kind of cover this, and I don't know how many weapons this applies to, but we'll get into that in a bit. And it actually has determined why I use some sights on some weapons. Now, let's get into comparing all of the sights, and we'll keep it pretty simple with some still images looking at the same scene in the practice range, starting off with the XP, because the XP actually does have a good variety of sights to choose from. Now, let's first look at the iron sight. The iron sight is going to be the most zoomed out option on most weapons. And then we're going to look at the reflector, which is the kind of starter for a few weapons like the XP, the LH1, and the FAMAS also have that option, but we're going to get into the differences between those in a bit. Then we have the red dot sight. After that, we have the adder reticle, and then the looking glass, and finally the holographic sight. Now, as you'll notice, all sights have the same zoom multiplier on the XP. The only thing that zooms out is the iron sight. Now, before I get into my opinion on what I think is the best, I want to cover some of the differences on the other classes with some of the same sights, or if there even is any difference, most of them are going to be the same. So first, we're going to be looking at the LH1 since it is on light as well. And there is something that I want to point out that is a little bit different about the reflector versus the XP. Now, if we're looking at the iron sight, we can see that it's the same zoom multiplier as the XP. The adder reticle, which is kind of the default for all the other sights, is the same multiplier as those. However, the reflector is actually zoomed in a little bit more than the other sights. However, when you were looking at the XP, again, the reflector has the same multiplier as the rest of the sights, so it is more zoomed in on the LH1, even though they do have the exact same name for the sight, which got me a little bit curious about the FAMAS and whether or not that zooms in as much as the LH or the XP because there is no glint on it. So when looking at the FAMAS, the iron sight again has that same zoomed out look. And then when we look at the adder reticle, again is the same multiplier as the rest of the adders and basic sights. And the reflector on this class actually does zoom in the same amount that the LH1 does, but it doesn't suffer from a glint. And we can go back and see the holographic sight again has that sort of middle ground zoomed in. However, there is something that is pretty unique with the FAMAS that I found when using different sights, and that is the way that the recoil looks. I haven't really tested or seen this on a lot of other weapons. I don't really play medium as much as I do heavy and light. So if there are other weapons out there, I might not have noticed it. It is something that took me a while to even notice on the FAMAS, but here is what I'm talking about. So as you'll see here with the reflector sight, there is no wobble to the sight itself, the red part of it, the chevron. However, when we look at the holographic sight or any of the sights, you'll see that the sight is actually wobbling a little bit. As you can see here, that holographic sight sort of wobbles with the sight or almost against it. And again, back here, you can see it is a lot more stable. And I'm going to slow it down for you guys so that you guys can see it even better. But this is something that is pretty noticeable when slowed down. So for that reason, on weapons like this, I use the reflector, which is sort of the baseline sight that you might have with some of these weapons. Some of the new sights might not fully be functioning, and I don't know if this is the only isolated case of it, but at least for me, the FAMAS, I use the reflector. I also do like the extra zoom multiplier that I get with it, but this is something to keep in mind when using sights, or if something feels a little bit off, try using a different sight. I've also seen some bugs with certain skins acting a little bit weirdly with some of the new sights, so that is definitely something to look out for. Now, when it comes to personal preference, for myself, I use the adder reflex on basically every single gun that has the option for it. And then when it comes to stuff like the FAMAS, I do use the reflector, which was the default that kind of came with it. I do like the zoom, and I also like that it is a little bit more stable when shooting. And when it comes to the AK, I actually really like using the AKM with iron sights. I don't really know why. I think I'm just so used to using iron sight AKs from every other shooter that I've played that it just feels right. That's one of the few weapons where I actually do that. Most other weapons I don't really use the iron sights for. I would love to use the XP iron sights, but most of the iron sights do have a little bit more wobble. It's a little bit more visual clutter and jankiness, but the AK for some reason just kind of feels at home even with all that jankiness. So for that reason, I typically am going to recommend that you find a sight that works for you, whether it is a bigger sight picture or less visual clutter outside of that sight picture. Something like the Looking Glass is a fantastic middle ground and was my starting point for the season until I found what worked best for me. And even though this doesn't necessarily mean that it is the correct choice, something that you can kind of go by is if you are further back from the target, you might want a bigger sight picture such as the Looking Glass or the holographic sight. And if you're a little bit closer up, you could use something like the compact reflector, the red dot, or the ASUS reticle. Since I do tend to play a lot of light and heavy, that means that I'm very often right up in people's faces with SMGs or LMGs, so that means that I like having something with a little bit more clarity and less visual clutter outside of my sight picture. But that obviously doesn't mean that you can't use whatever you prefer, so get out there and just find something that works best for you. Hope this has been pretty informative, and I will see you in the finals.